Today, we're going to look at the US-China rivalry from a totally different angle. We're diving into the perspective of several top Chinese academics to unpack how they see this whole global power struggle playing out. It's a view you probably haven't heard before. And right off the bat, they don't pull any punches. Think about that word for a second, neurotic. They're basically saying the US is an unpredictable, emotionally driven player on the world stage. And their core argument? That China is the only country with the stability and strength to actually manage that. So where does that kind of confidence come from? Well, for these professors, it all starts back in 2018 with the trade war. And in their minds, the fight is already over and the verdict is in. The way they tell it, the US didn't just pick a fight with China. It picked a fight with the whole world. And they say most countries just folded. But China? China didn't just stand its ground. It hit back, matching every tariff with one of its own. And just like that, what started as a global brawl turned into a one-on-one showdown between the two biggest economies on the planet. And this right here is their main takeaway. We're not talking about a tie or some kind of partial victory. We're talking about a clear, decisive win for China. Okay, that's a huge claim. So what's the evidence they're pointing to? Well, it really boils down to this number, $1.08 trillion. Remember, the whole stated goal of the US tariffs was to shrink its trade deficit with China. But these academics point out that the exact opposite happened. China's overall trade surplus didn't just grow, it exploded to an all-time record. For them, this is the ultimate proof that the US strategy didn't just fail, it backfired spectacularly. Which brings them to this incredibly sharp, uncompromising conclusion. It's not just that China was resilient. It's that if you judge the American strategy by its own stated goals, it was, in their words, a complete loss. Okay, so if the US lost so badly, the big question is, how? I mean, how does a superpower miscalculate on this scale? According to these professors, the US made a series of critical mistakes because it fundamentally misunderstood how the global economy actually works today. They say the US made two fatal assumptions. First, America thought its ultimate weapon was its giant consumer market, but it completely overlooked how much its own economy depended on Chinese imports to keep prices low. The second assumption was that tariffs would magically bring all the manufacturing jobs back home. But after decades of deindustrialization, the factories, the supply chains, the skilled workers, they just weren't there anymore. But this is where their analysis gets really deep. They argue that this whole conflict was never really about trade deficits. It was about psychology. In their view, the idea of American supremacy, of being number one, is the glue that holds a very divided American society together. So the fear of another country, especially China, taking that top spot isn't just an economic problem, it's an existential threat to America's identity itself. All right, so if the American strategy was reactive and psychological, what was driving China's response? Well, the professors argue it wasn't just luck. It was a deliberate two-pronged strategy that China had put in motion almost a decade before the trade war even started. And they break this strategy down into two really simple but powerful ideas. First, secure your supply chain so that no one can ever cut you off from critical technology. And second, diversify your customer base so that you're not dependent on any single country for your exports. That's it. That was the game plan. The first part of the plan was called Made in China 2025. This was a massive, state-driven push to upgrade from making clothes and toys to dominating high-tech industries like robotics and, crucially, semiconductors. The goal was simple: technological independence. So when the US eventually launched its tech war, they argue China was already years ahead in building its own domestic alternatives. Now, the second part of the plan was all about rewiring China's trade relationships with the rest of the world. And just look at the results. By the time the trade war really got going, the US market had already shrunk to just 11% of China's exports. Meanwhile, trade with developing nations in its Belt and Road Initiative had ballooned, making them China's single biggest trading partner. America was simply no longer the center of China's economic world. And to explain this strategy, they use a really powerful metaphor from China's own revolutionary past. The cities are the established Western powers, like the US and Europe. Instead of fighting them head-on, the strategy was to win over the countryside, all the developing nations of the world. By building deep economic ties there, they argue, China created an entirely new economic bloc that insulated it from Western pressure. So let's recap their argument. China won the trade war. It outmaneuvered the US with a long-term strategy. So what's next? Well, this brings us to their final and most provocative claim that we're living through a complete reshaping of the entire global order. For years, everyone in business was talking about China plus one, this idea of diversifying supply chains away from China. Well, these professors flip that concept completely on its head. They ask, what if we're actually heading toward a world minus one? A world where the United States is the one voluntarily backing away from the global system that it created. And that's the future they see. It's not some aggressive takeover by China. Instead, it's about a power vacuum being created by an America that's becoming more and more inward-looking. In this view, China isn't really seizing a global leadership role so much as being pushed into it, whether it's actually ready for it or not. And this brings them to their final point. It's not a celebration, but a really sober look at the massive challenges that come with this new position. China, they say, has to transform its entire economy from being the world's producer to being a primary consumer. It has to take on responsibility for global public goods, things like security and stability. And maybe hardest of all, it has to change its entire mindset from being a challenger to being a leader. And so they leave us with one huge, lingering question. After winning the battle, is China truly prepared for the burdens that come with victory?